Don't be put off by that. Shows the amount of dialogue that there is in a big day in Glasgow, day 2 of the summit. 2 very important agreements. Let me bring them straight to your attention. Firstly, to halt deforestation, and by 2030 to control the commercial destruction of trees. Big nations here have agreed to fund the transition with $12 billion. What does that money buy? How effective can that really be to stop the rape of too many jungles that are vital to neutralizing carbon dioxide and saving the planet? Leading experts will be sharing their views here in Nature's Newsroom. And there's a big agreement as well to control methane. You may say, why? It is the hidden gas emitted by animals and heats the atmosphere 120 times more than carbon dioxide. Methane produces the equivalent of 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide. It contributes 4% of total emissions. So deforestation and methane. First, the deforestation agreement. Nigel Topping is very important, a senior figure in the COP26 structures here in Glasgow for the British government. He's the high-level champion for COP26. Nigel Topping, how significant is this deforestation agreement?
It's a huge deal, right? We know that there's no route to net zero without ending deforestation and returning forests to being sinks. And for the first time, we're seeing practical commitments from governments, from the entire value chain of food companies, commodity traders, and the commodity producers, and crucially the finance sector as well.
But a lot of deforestation has happened by evasion of regulation. Impunity is a problem, and companies who are self-governing themselves and not really being honest. Can that be stopped?
Well, I think 2 things to say. Of course, if governments aren't implementing their own regulations, that's a problem. The exciting thing I think now is that actually technology's got to the point where we've got much better ability to trace commodities and to know where they've come from and whether they've come from a place which has been illegally logged or whether they've come from a legal, sustainable production practice. So I think it's the combination of the commitments and our ability to credibly and transparently track them that we didn't have 5 years ago that is going to be the key to this being a success.
What does the $12 billion go to? What does it buy?
Well, it buys the transformation from unsustainable practices to sustainable practices. Crucially, we're seeing now these big commitments to restore land. And of course, one way that you can reduce pressure on deforestation is to invest in restoring degraded land, which has become unproductive. So you take the pressure off the need to create new farmland, and then we're seeing some of that money has to flow to the smallholder farmers who are producing commodities in a regenerative way. Because if they don't have the incentive to change their farming practices, why would they do that?
And so the loggers as well have to be given an incentive. It's as blunt as that, is it?
Well, I think that if you look at Costa Rica, for example, Costa Rica pays for standing forests. So absolutely, how can you expect somebody who owns land not to take the easy economic choice of cutting down logs, which are worth more to them chopped than standing, if you don't create the right economic incentive? So that incentive shift is a crucial part of this transformation as well.
But what about the big companies who are making vast amounts of money by exploiting the jungles? Do they feel obliged? Will they feel obliged to change?
Well, I think now that we're seeing trillions of dollars of financial capital committing to ending agricultural commodity-driven deforestation from their portfolios, the finance starts to dry up for anyone who's not able to demonstrate that they are only financing commodities which are produced in a sustainable way. So that, of course, some companies will commit in good faith, others will need the policy signals and the finance signals to, if you like, to nudge them towards complying with this process. 2
quick things while you're with us. Methane.
Yeah.
How significant is the movement there which you're detecting?
It's huge, right? It's actually...
are you going to get an agreement here?
Well, there's going to be a lot of countries committing and a lot of companies committing to reducing methane leakage. And as you know, the crucial thing about methane is that it's a very powerful greenhouse gas, particularly in the short term. So the crucial thing is that we really need action now to get that. And so every ton of methane that's leaked is accelerating global warming much faster than a ton of CO2, particularly in the short term. So yeah, I think we're going to see some exciting announcements today.
A last question while you're here. What would you say is the mood? Is there a feeling of a last minute to midnight? Because last minute to midnight was, of course, the warning about nuclear war as well. In other words, and the language from Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, this is a catastrophe.
I think there is, but I think there's also a resolve to turn, not to panic, but to turn that into very concrete actions this decade. And that's, so whether it's on deforestation or on methane or some of the technological commitments we're going to hear later today, it's about what do we do this decade to keep 1.5 alive.
You've got a large number of people sitting the other side of the glass waiting to hear from you. Nigel, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. Thanks a lot.
Nigel Topping there talking to me, I have to say, just before the methane deal was confirmed. Well, I'm joined by Dame Elizabeth Corley, who's chair designate of Schroders, the investment managers. Elizabeth, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
Let me just pick up on that word. You've heard all the kind of language which was used yesterday among the leaders about catastrophe, etc., etc. Is that having an impact, adding an extra mile, a few more kilometres to thinking and radical thinking?
I think the pace has been accelerating for the last 2 years, frankly, ever since January 2020 in Davos, and you've seen an acceleration. And I think people are realizing that every year that passes is a year that's gone forever in terms of making progress and taking action. And I think that has permeated into the financial services industry very strongly.
But there's a real urgency, isn't it? It's not just a year passing, it's a month passing or a week passing.
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting to hear Nigel talk in decades. And I think we are within a decade of 2030 now. We're within 3-4 years of the 2025 commitment on deforestation-free financing. So we're now starting to talk in years. I don't think we're yet talking in months.
What about the emphasis on nature? I should say that you are part of several large financial organisations, including the Green Finance Institute. It's a long list. I'm not going to give it to everyone at the moment, but you are deep into finance. When you look at the reaction of the financial services and the kind of sector you're now representing, how would you say they are now equipped to handle this enormity of now deforestation, now methane?
I think it's like everything. You've got the early movers and those who are absolutely committed to drive change, and I would put organisations like Schroders very much in that, wanting to see change happen at pace. You've got those in the middle who are waiting for more signals, whether that's policy signals from government or, importantly, signals from their clients saying, hurry up, we don't want to wait any longer. And then you've got laggards who think, well, I'm not going to move until I'm forced to. I think what I'm seeing in the last 6 to 12 months is a shift in that curve, a shift in the right direction for more pace.
Because one of the other issues which is critical is the role of nature. It's an externality which has a cost.
Absolutely
and many
right.
in your business have been very reluctant to accept that.
I don't know if it's reluctance. I think it's complicated and it's very difficult because, first of all, we haven't even got a carbon definition that works globally yet. And at least now there's an acceptance of science-based targets around carbon. If you move into nature, the definitions of nature, of natural capital, natural cycle, become very complex and the information isn't available. I think there's an enormous interest of investing in a way that's sustainable around natural capital, an enormous interest. People recognize, exactly as you say, it has not been priced, the externalities are unpriced, the risks are not being noted, and the opportunities are not being financed adequately enough.
But is there a sense of urgency there? After all, it's 8 months since the Das Gupta report, who emphasised the importance of nature. Prince Charles has been saying it for years.
Absolutely.
Others have been saying it, but now it's there, centre on the front of every agenda.
Which is brilliant. And I think what we can't do is take the same time on nature as we did on carbon to accept the urgency. So absolutely, His Royal Highness has been there from the beginning. His Sustainable Markets Initiative is key. The Natural Capital Investment Alliance that Schroders has joined, and there are now 15 asset managers part of that, $10 billion of assets committed to be deployed by the end of 2022. So I think the urgency is there, but we need much more than 10 billion. And that deployment will actually, we hope, catalyse greater amounts of money that get invested, but invested for proper impact, environmental and social. As you'll have heard today and yesterday, Indigenous people have a huge role to play, Indigenous communities, in helping us to get it right, and we cannot ignore them.
We've had a lot of voices on in the last 24 hours, but you're going to become shortly chair of Schroders.
I hope so, if the shareholders have me.
As chair of a board, you have to set a tone.
Yes.
And you have to set a tone not just for the organisation you run, but also a broader tone. How much do you think you're fighting a traditional mindset still within the finance sector?
In Schroders, not at all, I would say. And part of the
Everyone
reason
gets it.
I think the whole board understands that our responsibility is intergenerational. I mean, it's still a substantially family-owned firm, long-term patience, intergenerational thoughtfulness. We have a financial duty to our clients and to our shareholders, and we will absolutely always fulfill that. But yes, absolutely get the fact that environment and social matters now are central to investment decision making. Now, I think there are other investment managers who feel the same, and they're very much always with us in the alliances that we form to drive this forward. I think there are parts of the investment industry waiting for greater leadership and clarity on the opportunities.
Because you used the word laggards earlier.
I did, and I will say that because there are people who will always be at the end of a tail. I don't think they're the ones we need to worry about. I think what we need to focus on is demonstrating that natural capital is a really good investment opportunity. It can be done in a way that generates real outcomes and impacts, both environmental and for social communities, and it has an investment return. And that's why we're part of the alliance. Final
thought, I remember your chief executive at the Green Finance Institute saying a year ago at the first convening of their conferences that there's still a real mindset problem in the finance business. If I ask you now for where you think you'll be in a year's time, do you think there will be a real sense of radicalism and determination, pressured by shareholders and also stakeholders? I
think we will see faster pace, whether it is radicalism, whether it is, if you like, revolution as opposed to rapid evolution. I wouldn't go that far, but I do think we'll see the pace of evolution and change increasing exponentially in the next 12 to 18 months.
And politely, you'll be cracking the whip a little bit at Schroders.
I don't need to do that at Schroders. It's a great team.
Or in your other organisations. Dame Elizabeth, thank you very much indeed for joining us here at the Nature Newsroom.
Thank you.
So what will an international deal on deforestation achieve? What will $12 billion buy? I was joined from Washington by Francis Seymour of the World Resources Institute. First, though, Dan Zarin, who is Executive Director for Forests and Climate at the Wildlife Conservation Society. Dan Zarin, the deforestation deal, is it enough? Will it be urgent enough? Will it force change?
Well, it's a very good development. I think what we're seeing is a strong commitment from world leaders. 110 leaders signed on collectively to a pledge to indeed work collectively to end deforestation by 2030, indeed to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030. What that means and how it will be implemented will be different in different countries. Some places are clearly more serious than others, and the rubber meets the road at national level, but the collective international commitment is there, quite positive, and there is a substantial and really unprecedented financial commitment behind it of about $12 billion from a large number of donors to support work towards that end, with many subsidiary commitments and additional private sector commitments around that.
But to be clear, is it rapid enough? Does $12 billion really buy what is needed within the time of 2030?
Well, the way that I look at it is it's a very important, substantial down payment on what's needed.
But what does $12 billion achieve? What does $12 billion achieve?
What $12 billion should achieve is, first of all, it puts these issues at center stage. Right? We now have global commitment around forests and biodiversity as central to the climate change agenda. And indeed, as President Biden said this morning, a link on that agenda towards pandemic prevention and public health. And the amount of funding is unprecedented in terms of putting that money towards actually addressing the problem.
Well, let's go to Washington, D.C., to Francis Seymour. Francis, welcome, Distinguished Senior Fellow at the World Resources Institute. Do you believe this is enough and as decisive as Dan is suggesting?
Listen, it's always thrilling to hear heads of state talk about forests, and that's what we heard this morning. And I think what's significant about their declaration is that it was really, framed in a sense of systems change, as Boris Johnson mentioned in his remarks. And while the $12 billion is, a step change from the kinds of public finance commitments for forests that we've heard in the past, frankly speaking, it's still small compared to the trillions of dollars in private financial flows that are sloshing around and, the large amounts of public sector subsidies that drive deforestation. So I think this systemic change is actually something we need to focus on in addition to the $12 billion allocated to solve the problem, and look at how we're going to redirect funds that are causing the problem. And that's why these financial sector commitments that Dan just alluded to are quite important. If we get the investors that control the trillions to get deforestation out of their portfolios, that in turn puts pressure on the companies and the countries that are still encouraging deforestation.
Well, let me put to you what a member of the Dayak community in Indonesia was saying to me a few hours ago. He said, we're dealing with impunity, people who rape the land and they know they can get away with it because they have to control it for themselves at the moment. Is that going to be put to an end, Dan?
Well, that's a very difficult question. I think
but it's an important question.
It's a very important one. I think, again, we're going to see things acting out differently in different places in the world. There are many places in the world where the political economy is structured in ways that actually lead to the problems that you're talking about. Now, simply throwing money at that is not going to entirely solve it. The question is the political will to address it. And as Francis is pointing to, does the economy, do the larger scale incentives actually shift? We heard from some people in the investment community at the just about half an hour ago saying we've got to move global capital markets to where they are actually incentivizing people and planet rather than incentivizing the degradation of people and planet. Now, if the financial community globally actually embraces that and shifts to really focusing on the issue of what forests do and the extent to which the global economy depends on forests, then we will be in much better shape. That shift is not happened, but for the first time, I think we are hearing important voices, both political voices and voices in the financial community, recognizing that that shift needs to happen. So we're at the cusp, and you're asking questions about what is it going to deliver. And we're going to find that out. Or
can it be delivered?
Or can it be delivered, right? We're going to find that out. We know that step changes, radical changes are possible. We've just seen countries globally, the global economy, invest trillions of dollars in dealing with the pandemic, on turning that ship around very quickly in relative terms, obviously still with huge human costs.
Well, let me check.
We need the same thing on the climate agenda and on the forest agenda.
Francis, let me just put to you those two phrases. Well, one word, impunity, but also the self-auditing, which is going on currently and being abused by many who are actually deforesting illegally and essentially raping the jungles.
So it's a great question, but I think we've got a two-pronged approach that we know can work. And that two-pronged approach is one, directing finance directly to some of these indigenous and local communities. We have evidence that if we empower them with the forest monitoring technology and capacity, they can actually decrease local deforestation rates by fighting the incursions into their territories. But they can't do it by themselves. And that's why the second prong is important, to provide financial incentives at the large scale, at the level of entire countries or large subnational jurisdictions, to say, if you do what only governments can do, enforce the law, change fiscal incentives, regulate companies, we will pay you for the forest carbon that you sequester at an attractive price. And you heard several heads of state from forest-rich countries today mention that need for the financial incentive. And also just to enable them to finance the very real costs that they incur in terms of monitoring their forests and fighting crime.
Let me ask you both finally about the other heads of state announcements. There's a danger we're going to get stuck on deforestation when other big things have been announced as well. Dan, in bullet point way, can you just highlight the kind of things we should also be looking at which have been announced?
So look, we're here at the Climate Change COP. There are really two things that are really critical that need to happen to address climate change. We need radical reductions in carbon emissions, not only obviously from nature, but from the whole energy and transportation economy. That enormous amount of decarbonization needs to proceed rapidly in the next 10 years. And at the same time, we need to protect forests, because forests are already preventing climate change from being anywhere from 30 to 50% worse than it already is. We're seeing announcements on both places. We're seeing a lot of commitments now around 2050, some in advance of 2050 to reach net zero by many countries across the economy. Right? Some countries are pushing further out, and I think we need to really see the implementation of what was the promise of Paris, that when countries make pledges, they are reviewed, ambition gets ratcheted up. That has been happening. It needs to happen faster because we've really just got this decade to make the difference we need to see.
Francis, again, those heads of state announcements, what else would you like to highlight?
I think, we're hearing a lot about long-term commitments and sort of general statements of collective responsibility. What we need to listen for is the short-term pledges for what individual governments and other stakeholders are going to do, not in 50 years, not in 10 years, but this year. And one of the most powerful statements this morning was from Hindu Ibrahim, an indigenous woman from Chad, who said, she's going to be looking 1 year from now, what you've done in the next year, because in 1 year, the trust will be gone. So we really need to be listening for statements about what people are going to do when they leave this conference, not in 10 years or 50 years' time.
Quickly, a minute on this from each of you. The investment community, investors, customers, suppliers, and so on, how much will they be forced to change because of what has been announced and agreed this morning?
Well, they need to change a lot. I mean,
but will they?
Well, what we're seeing is trillions of dollars in investor funds committed to making that change. Now, that is a start. As I said before, this is a down payment. We need to move the whole community, the lion's share of capital markets, to be nature positive, to be addressing the climate issues.
So their activity will be crucial in all of this.
Oh, it's absolutely critical because at the end of the day, what we're hearing in all of these announcements is money talks, right? Where the financial commitments are, the commitments more in the investment space, how people are making money. Are they making money from exploiting nature, from exploiting other people, or are they making money by investing in the value of nature and in a more inclusive economy?
Well, let me check
That's
that with
the change we need.
Francis, your view on this, about how vital the investor, the financial community, the supplier community is going to be in all of this, laying down very clear conditions. We won't buy from you unless.
Well, it's critical, and I think what's important here is that we are seeing the process of establishment of a new norm, that it is no longer acceptable to finance deforestation. And now with the technology and monitoring that we have and the ability to trace money and trace goods, we're able to call them out. And so they face financial, reputational risk from doing it. And in addition, they increasingly appreciate that they face material risk because their own investments are threatened by the local effects of deforestation on their operations that they're investing in. So I think it's an important watershed.
Francis Seymour from the World Resources Institute in Washington and Dan Zorin here in Glasgow from the Wildlife Conservation Society. Thank you both very much indeed for those perspectives. Well, let's pick up on that critical issue of investment. I'm joined by Emin Ishil, who is from Norway, who's from Shortterm Asset Managers. And you heard there, the very clear message, particularly from Francis. This is a new norm. It is not acceptable to finance deforestation anymore. Is that already your experience?
Yes, and first of all, thank you very much for having me here. And this is the new norm. I think there is no credible pathway to 1.5 degrees without nature. If you're going to claim to be credible about, if you're going to claim to do climate change, we cannot do that without deforestation, without ending deforestation. It accounts for 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions.
Do your investors accept that now?
Yes, and in Storebrand we have been working on deforestation for a decade now. We had a similar commitment. We made that already in 2019, a 2025 commitment. But this calls for joint action and collaboration. So we're very pleased to see a broad range of actors coming together now today, governments, financial institutions, companies, and committing to end deforestation.
What kind of signal is sent by this agreement? Because there are still many who say it's still not enough. It may sound big, $12 billion, et cetera,
Yeah.
but actually there are still many out there who are very cunning at evading efforts to control them.
Yeah. And that's a fair point. We have seen that in 2014 with the 2020 commitment, which were not achieved, that people are a bit reluctant to see all these commitments. So we need to turn these commitments into concrete actions. We need to identify, map our portfolios, identify companies at risk, and engage with these companies.
But do you have those maps already?
We have done it in Storebrand. We have identified and mapped our portfolios, identified companies at risk, upstream and downstream, but also banks that we're invested in. And we're engaging with these companies currently.
And do you have enough data to know precisely what is happening and who's doing what around the world in forests?
No, we don't. And that is the main challenge with deforestation. And that is what you will hear from many investors. We don't have reliable and consistent data, but we have enough data to drive change.
There are those who say that what you're seeing on deforestation is equivalent to what we've seen with other international protocols. Ultimately, despite skepticism, it does work. But are you saying that there are those out there who have ingenuity to be able to evade the attempts to sort of police them?
That's a very challenging question, but I think we have to. We as an investor community, we cannot. There are no credible pathways to 1.5 degree. And the investor community 2 years ago, it was maybe not. There were no one committing to net zero. Today, everybody has committed to net zero, and we have to put that into concrete action. And obviously, for obvious reasons, we have focused on the energy sector, the transport sector, because they're the highest emitting sectors. But we have, as a community, ignored land use change, agriculture, forestry, and we have to also look at those emissions.
Well, let me pick up on that, which is a broader question than just deforestation, about the role of nature, picking up what I was talking to Dame Elizabeth Corley about, and what is now so prevalent here, the fact that nature has to be factored in as a cost and an externality.
Yeah.
Are you seeing that very clearly now?
Yes, I think it's the first climate COP that has managed to put nature at the center of climate change. It is important for mitigation. It has the potential to solve 1/3 of the mitigation challenges, but it's important for adaptation as well. So I think that is what we are seeing, the development of nature, the two twin crises being handled in a more joint and systematic manner.
All right, Emin Schiel, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Storebrand Asset Managers in Norway. Welcome. Now, let's move on to the other big deal of the day. Stay where you are, Emin. Don't walk across me when I'm talking to the camera. Then comes the second big deal here at COP26, a determined effort to cut methane by huge amounts. Methane contributes 4% of all global emissions. Yes, 4%. I was joined in the Nature Newsroom by 3 guests. Nusa Urbancic, welcome. I'm going to speak to you first because you're campaigns director at the Changing Markets Foundation. How much is the methane challenge really understood, given the ubiquity of it?
So methane is a relatively new issue, but this year it really got speed because the scientists have said that this is one of the critical things we have to do to stay under 1.5 degree global heating. So we analyzed what are the biggest meat and dairy companies doing about it. And we found out not very much. Although they know it's a problem, they're not having any action plans, any measures or any targets to address this issue. And this is important because livestock methane is 32% of the total, so we should really be doing something about it.
Well, we'll talk about those details in a moment. Let's go to Paris, to Zelke, who is founder and president of the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development. Welcome. Can you just give me the basic science? Because I've got data here which suggests that every year the methane burped and farted, particularly from animals, has the same warming effect as 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide.
can do to slow climate change. It represents about half of all warming today, and it has the unique characteristic of being short-lived in the atmosphere. And that means when you cut it, it produces cooling very quickly, gives us a chance to win the 10-year sprint to 2030 and stay below the 1.5 as we pursue the marathon to net zero at 2050.
Is it controllable in your view?
Almost all of it is controllable and at low cost. So you start with the oil and gas and coal sector. Now we're phasing out of that and moving to clean energy, but along the way, it's essential to stop the leaks of methane. We know how to do it. It actually saves the companies money and preserves their social license to operate.
Let me just
The
check.
next piece, of course, is
Let me just check one bit of data, if I can, Durwood. Methane, 120 times more warming the moment it reaches the atmosphere. Is it that serious?
well, because when you measure it over a 20-year period, it's that big. And that's our relevant time frame. It's probably not even 20 years. It's 10 years. Because within this next 10 years, the self-amplifying feedbacks of the Earth will start to turn from our friend to a foe, and we'll lose control of the climate system. So methane in that period, that 10 to 20 year period, is the single most important strategy the world can pursue.
All right, let's work out where the New Deal is going to take us on that. But first, let's go to Terrado, who's joining us from southern Spain, who's senior research scientist at Greenpeace Research Laboratories, normally at the University of Exeter. Reis, welcome. What can you add about the science here and the enormity of the challenge, particularly what is being produced by animals?
Yes, so animal agriculture is the single biggest emitter of methane of human activity, from human activity. So it's one of the key elements we need to limit if we are to really reach a safe climate, controlling methane. Cutting animal agriculture is actually like an emergency brake into methane emissions. But the current pledges are not really including animal agriculture into it. Every climate scientist is actually saying we need to eat less meat and dairy, but politicians need to catch up with this fact.
How much, what is the volume in your view, in your scientific assessment, what is the volume of methane that is the big challenge?
So we need to, methane emissions from agriculture represents around half of all methane emissions into the atmosphere from human activities. From that, around 90% of the agricultural emissions come from enteric fermentation, that is from the digestive system of the animals, and from manure. So the biggest chunk of that limit of emissions within agriculture is coming from the animals. This is why this component is essential if we are to limit global warming in the short term. Methane has a global warming potential 8 times that of CO2 in 20 years and 30 times in 100 years compared to CO2. This is why it is very important to limit it in the short term. If we are to reduce temperature in the next decades, it is essential that we reduce methane alongside reducing CO2 for the long term, especially.
All right, well, let's go back to Nusa Urbancic from the Changing Markets Foundation here in Glasgow. Because, Nusa, I'm going to hold this up, and we're not going to go into the detail here. Some of you may be able to pick up some of the names of some of the companies, but I'm just showing you this because there is a list here which starts with the most guilty, if you like, by the standards of your analysis, the companies and how they are handling this. What is your analysis of the view of these large corporates making big money from agriculture and their attitude to methane?
Yeah, so we produced the first ever ranking of global meat and dairy corporations and what they're doing on climate and methane specifically. So these are the companies that together have annual income of $500 billion, which is equal to GDP of Sweden. And it shows that the best performer, Nestle, only got 1/3 of the points.
That's Nestle at the top.
Yeah, at the top. And the worst one, French group Biga, which is the biggest European
Right down at the
processor
bottom.
of beef, got 0. So, and the average score of meat company was 7.5%, and the average point of dairy was around 15%. So you can see they're not at all addressing this issue.
Are they in denial? Are they lacking willpower? Is it just a matter of time before they have to be pushed, if not forced, into changing?
I think the Global Methane Pledge is a great opportunity to actually change this, because it does have a gap. It doesn't go the whole way of what is needed. 30% is what the governments agreed, but we need to do more. And we need to do more anyway to transform our food system, also to cut CO2 emissions. And for this reason, we are saying this is a great opportunity for governments to fix their broken food systems.
Well, let's go to Derwood if we can. Derwood in Paris, you've been involved in negotiating and specifying and producing the fine print in this methane deal. What is there going to be which is going to be manageable and also achieve the kind of reduction in methane production which you all say is so vital?
The Methane Pledge is a great step along the way to more intense management of methane. And I'll refer us all to the sectoral agreement that has protected the stratospheric ozone layer, the Montreal Protocol. This should be our inspiration. It is the single most important climate treaty. It has already solved an amount of warming that otherwise would equal what CO2 causes today. And if we use the architecture of that agreement and apply it to methane in the next few years, literally the next 2 to 3 years, we can have a chance of keeping the planet below 1.5.
Well, Derwood, I have here NUSA's Changing Markets Foundation document, which says right at the top, blind spot, how lack of action on livestock methane undermines climate targets. What's in the protocol, what's in the deal, which is going to force the agricultural producers of methane and those who buy the products from the cattle which produce methane, what is there in the deal which is going to force a change of heart from these big companies?
Well, I think what we're seeing is that the heads of state of the world have finally woken up to the fact that methane is an essential target. So this means that if you're the head of one of these large dairy farms or meat producers, you will lose your social license to operate if you do not learn to control methane, and to do it in the very, very short term, in the next couple of years. I mean, this means that the cops are after you now. That's the signal that the Methane Pledge is sending to the world.
Is it going to be that rigorous? Literally, the cops are after you, not this COP where we are at the moment. You're talking about, if you like, the methane policeman.
Well, I think, again, the way these things work is that you start and you strengthen. So we know that we can go after the emissions from oil and gas and coal immediately, save money, they're dirt cheap. We can go after landfill. Agriculture is a little trickier, and you want to look at the best jurisdictions, for example, California, which is a big agricultural state in the US, and to see what strategies they're using, including how you shift subsidies for agriculture. We expend a tremendous amount of public money on agriculture, and if we shift from the damaging to the good, we can keep the farmers in business, we can keep the food on the table, and we can reduce methane and save the planet.
Let me go to Terrado. The issue here, of course, is net zero. That's what the great ambition is. How does methane, this kind of reduction in methane production, how will that impact on the net zero ambitions?
So I think it's really important to go back to the fact that animal agriculture, going back to nature, So animal agriculture takes around a quarter of the land on the planet. So it has a very big impact on nature, both from the emissions of methane, but also for the destruction of ecosystems. So when we look at what can be done, when we are limiting, if we limit the production and consumption of animals worldwide, we will be limiting the emissions of methane, which is a very big important element that is missing on this pledge. Actually, it talks about technological solutions within the methane in agriculture, but it doesn't really look about reducing meat and dairy. And secondly, if we limit production and consumption of meat and dairy, we're also limiting the pressure on land. And we are then allowing for protection and restoration of natural ecosystem, which takes me to net zero, which is really important if we are going to get to net zero. For net zero, we need to reduce emissions, both from CO2 and methane, and we also need to protect and restore forest. Both of them are essential, and in the intersection, you will find animal agriculture. At the moment, that's a blind spot.
All right, 15 seconds each. I want to know whether you think this will really work. First of all, Nusa, do you think this really can work, that the kind of companies you've listed here will listen and have to take notice?
They have to be regulated. What our research shows also, 8 of these companies are based in Europe, 5 of them are based in North America, 1 is in New Zealand. So these are all governments that could force these companies to set science-based targets, to start reporting on methane and start reducing it.
Derwood, do you believe this really will make a difference in line with CFCs and the Montreal Protocol and what they have achieved in the last 20 or 30 years?
It will work, and it will work fast in the next 2 to 3 years. I guarantee we'll see a new agreement modeled after the Montreal Protocol that slams on the brakes of methane.
Thank you. And finally, Race, are you optimistic? Do you agree with both Nusa and Derwood?
It will work. It will work because not only science is already saying it clearly, also young people are changing their behavior. When we eat less meat and dairy, we're telling governments that we need to shift incentives and policies away from factory farming and industrial agriculture into plant-based diets that are healthy for the planet and healthy for everyone else.
Well, Race, Derwood and Nusa, thank you very much indeed for those prospects, I have to say, and the perspectives on methane. It looks like things are moving and you're all optimistic. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, central to everything we're considering is data. There's still a lack of data on so many issues, so many critical issues, as we were hearing earlier in this broadcast. Joining me are 2 leading figures who actually whose job is to manage and to scrutinize data. Fred Onai, who is a project manager from Uganda. Welcome, Fred. And also Giselle Denyo, who's coordinator for the Vice Ministry for International Cooperation in the Dominican Republic.
Thank you.
First of all, what kind of data are you now able to get? Are you amazed almost at what you can see, particularly from satellite scrutiny?
Yeah, geospatial data is quite amazing. As a biodiversity hotspot, Dominican Republic really needs to understand more deeply all the ecosystems, the biodiversity loss, and all the communities that depend on them. We have coral reefs, we have broadleaf forests, we have mangroves. So these geospatial data allow us to understand what is the dynamic that's happening on these places and how climate change is impacting biodiversity in these ecosystems.
Fred, and your experience in Uganda?
Yeah, it's a great experience because, as she has said, the spatial data has done a great deal. It has moved us from policy thinking that are not science-based. It is promoting the science-based policy interface based on the spatial data. We have moved to map the entire Uganda into what we call the nature-based solutions area of action.
The entire area of Uganda?
Yes, the entire Uganda in terms of nature-based solutions action areas. Protection, which takes 20%. Then we have got restoration, which takes 13%. And I've got a management, that's sustainable management, that takes 20%. All this we are doing to promote, 1, biodiversity integrity, that's for ecosystem services, for human livelihoods and sustainable development, but also climate resilience.
Giselle, just give me an idea of, or give us an idea of the kind of precision that you can now get from data in the way that you've described?
Well, we can get granular data on biodiversity loss, on degradation, on
But what
land.
does it show? Well, give me an example or two.
An example, it would show in time the percentage of forest that has gone from a coniferous forest, to say an example, to agricultural land, right? So we would be able to see this and see the impact in land use change in Dominican Republic.
Have you discovered remarkable things which you didn't know beforehand from this geospatial data?
Yes, quite a lot. First of all, the issue of zoning the entire country in terms of nature-based solutions action areas, and secondly, the issue of having targets, policy targets that are now meaningful. Because now we are able, for example, to develop targets for wetlands coverage in the country from 9.08% in 2021 to 9.57 in 2024. The same with the forest. We are going to have a target because of the data we have got now, which is real-time data from the current 12.5% to 15% in 2025. So all this because now we have got spatial data in place, and besides, we have now joined the UN, the biodiversity lab that now give us the more information, more databases that we can now plan. We can now inform policy through data other than just having actions. So we are looking at it from data to information to policy action planning and implementation, monitoring, review, and the improvement.
Well, Fred and Giselle, yes. Thank you very much indeed. Two views there from Uganda and from the Dominican Republic. Thank you both very much indeed for explaining the intricacies of what now can be seen, particularly geospatial data. You're with the Nature Newsroom. Rushed. Thank you, Fred. This way. at the COP26 Climate Summit here in Glasgow in Scotland. I'm Nick Gowing. Let's keep talking about the kind of challenges that are being faced in so many areas. One of them is, of course, we've got the parallel crises of the climate emergency and the speed at which things have to be done, as highlighted yesterday by many of the leaders, and particularly the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres. But there's also another critical issue. We haven't yet got over the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. There is speculation about the kind of threat, challenge it's going to leave us with. And there are many epidemiological issues which have to be gone into. We're not going to be discussing that, but there is an important principle which we want to highlight for you here. And I'm joined by Nigel Sizer, who is Executive Director of the Preventing Pandemics at the Source Initiative, and also here in London, in Glasgow, by Nonette Royo. Welcome, Nonette, who is Executive Director of the Tenure Facility. And I hope down the line is Ari Bernstein, who is Interim Director of the Centre for Climate Health and the Global Environment at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, a paediatrician, Ari, at Boston's Children's Hospital. Welcome. But let me hear right from the get-go from all three of you the challenge and the deductions you are making about what we now face at a place which is considering the climate, but it's also a very significant challenge to society, another parallel challenge.
So humanity is facing two major crises right now, the climate emergency and the risk of future pandemics. Both of these crises result from a broken relationship with nature. All the pandemics start with spillover of viruses from other species into humans, and this risk is accentuated by clearing tropical forests, the wildlife trade, and livestock production. And climate change, also a key solution to the climate emergency, is protecting those forests and addressing livestock consumption. So we're looking at two crises with a common solution.
And common
the common solution is protecting tropical forests and reducing livestock consumption, changing the way we manage livestock. That helps reduce the risk of future pandemics, reducing the risk of spillover, and helps to reduce emissions that are leading to climate change.
Nonette.
It's in protection of forests. That is where indigenous peoples and local communities, these are the partners that we work with at the Tenure Facility. That's the role that they play, living, understanding, and integrating their lives with nature. So protection is key.
And are you agreeing with Nigel on the challenges, the two parallel challenges? Are they parallel or converging?
Converging is important to understand, but parallel, yes.
Ari Bernstein, joining us from the United States. Ari, what's your assessment here?
We convened an international task force at Harvard this summer to answer that question, and the assessment is exactly what you've just heard, that these are convergent crises, they have common solutions, and that those solutions are in fact the most cost-effective actions that we can take. Right now, we look at the climate crisis in isolation, but in fact, it is very much intertwined with our risk of emerging infections and also the severity of the pandemics we may see. As a very good example of that, we well know now that air pollution from burning fossil fuels has contributed substantially to the incidence and severity of the pandemic. That's also true of other emerging respiratory infections. But what you've heard is more or less what our scientific task force came up with this summer.
Let me ask each of you then, what do we learn? What has to be learned? What has to be moved forward with considerable energy? Nigel?
Well, what we saw here today in the Leaders Summit was a very important step forward. They committed several $1 billion of new money to protecting tropical forests. And this, what they didn't say, is that this will also help to prevent future pandemics. So they're missing a key part of the story.
Help me understand why.
Because when humans move in large numbers into these tropical forest areas, they are exposed to the viruses that live in the wildlife that they have not been exposed to before. There's more risk of spillover of these viruses into the people, especially when towns and settlements are established in frontier parts of Indonesia and Brazil and so on. And that accentuates the risk of new diseases entering the human species and spreading around the world.
So, Nonette, where does this go from here?
it's very important to emphasize that there are guardians of these forests. They understand the integrity of that entire ecosystem, and these are the indigenous peoples and local communities. Indigenous peoples, most especially, use traditional knowledge, have seen patterns over time, and they have told the world several times, this is not the way to go with our lifestyle now. So land rights is essentially the mechanism by which they can do this job with us. And the recognition of that was emphasized this morning in terms of the investments of funding to protect forests through recognition of land rights.
Ari Bernstein, let me keep moving this forward. How does this help us understand, but also prevent future pandemics?
The major source of pandemic risk, the root cause, as you heard from Nigel, is this movement of pathogens, particularly viruses, from animals to people. And so we really need to take actions that stop that. It is not adequate to simply try and deal with these problems after they start through vaccines. As one example, we can see right now that we've had a vaccine available in record time, and yet large swaths of the human population, particularly those most vulnerable in low-resource communities, have least access. So we really have a critical opportunity now to leverage our investments in conservation, both to the climate crisis and to indigenous rights, and then, of course, address this risk of spillover. The investments are critical, but we have to do them in a way that acknowledges that these aren't just investments in molecules of carbon. They're investments in indigenous peoples. They're investments in conserving the life upon which all of our health depends. And yes, they absolutely are critical to addressing the climate crisis.
Let me ask again, each of you, what role must governments play in all of this? And just before you answer this, I was very struck by listening to Bill Gates. You'll have your own view on this, but he said the thing about the pandemic is we could actually create a vaccine, and that helped us reduce the incidence of COVID. The trouble is, for climate emergency, you can't have a vaccination. You've got to think of it in a very different way.
Well, and also 97% of people in the least developed countries still haven't been vaccinated. So the vaccine only gets you so far. If we can prevent pandemics before they start by protecting forests, dealing with the wildlife trade, addressing some livestock management issues, stopping the risk of spillover, reducing the risk of spillover, that's actually the most equitable solution to all of these challenges.
And what role must governments play in this?
Pre-spillover means protection of the forest guardians that essentially prevent this from happening. So,
Ari Bernstein, last thought from you, if I can. What role must governments play in this, given that governments were essentially destabilized by the enormity of what's happened in the last almost 2 years?
They have a role in ensuring that the financing that's coming out of COP and other mechanisms is not siloed into molecules of carbon, but that the full value of those investments are recognized. And when they are, they'll become unavoidable investments that will be too good for anyone to refuse.
Do you believe they will do that?
I have seen progress. I'm not convinced it'll happen yet, but I think the coalition that Nigel's helped leading, the voices of people like that, are critical. And I think we have every reason to expect that progress will continue, but it's going to take work.
Yes or no, Nigel? Is it going to happen? Are governments going to realize this quickly?
It has to happen. How quickly?
It doesn't mean to say they'll do it.
How quickly they will realize is hard to say.
Nonette?
they will realize, and they are realizing it.
Belatedly. Thank you very much indeed, Nonette, for joining us. Nonette Royo and Nigel as well. Nigel Sizer and Dr. Ari Bernstein joining us from the United States. You're with the Nature Newsroom. I'm Nick Gowing. Stay with us. We'll be back in a short while.
Yeah, just make it really. What we want to try and do is like the journalists can take that thing. There's like, right, how does this fit? Yeah. They just want to know exactly what it means.
So two big announcements today, particularly on deforestation, the $12 billion, which is going to be given for trying to really make an impact on deforestation in the next 9 years till 2030. I'm joined here by Justin Adams, who is Tropical Forest Alliance, and also Sandrine Dixon-de Clèves. Welcome to you both. You're president of the Club of Rome. Now, what's your feeling about where we've got to on deforestation? Because there have been many voices welcoming this. Are they being too generous at the moment, or do you feel it really will have an impact? Sandrine.
Well, I was chairing the session, actually, and I must say that I do think it's going to have an impact. But we must make sure that it's material. The reason why I think it's going to have an impact is that, first of all, there are more than 100 countries. We've never had those kind of pledges before. Not only more than 100. Are they all committed? They're all committed. And committed for 2030. So this is the decisive decade. We know that we need commitments by 2030. And it's real money. It is money that's coming both from private sector and public sector, amounting to $19.2 billion. And we also have commitments from the MDBs. We have commitments from the investment community. So what we're seeing is that these commitments are coming both from the public and the private sector. They're going straight into stopping deforestation. And a very different part of this is the fact that they're also thinking very clearly about the lives and livelihoods of indigenous people and the communities that are the stewards of the land and the forests.
Justin, what about being cynical or skeptical about all of this? Because on this program yesterday, we had a leading representative of the Dayak community, the indigenous community in Indonesia. He said there are two problems: impunity, and also many of those who are essentially ripping out the forests feel they can get away with it because actually they are policing themselves.
There are enormous challenges in this forest agenda. We've known that for decades. And
so
part of the
reason worry justified.
There are absolutely fears, but I think today is a moment to step back and say, the world has never come together in the way it has today to actually commit to turn the tide on deforestation and to think about a nature positive future. So I'm choosing to take today a glass half full. But, as Sandrine said, the implementation now is going to be critical. But we've never had the finance sector engaged in the way that they've engaged today. Asset owners say,
really remarkable,
we do not want deforestation in our portfolios, the same way as they've figured out for coal and fossil fuels. Okay? We've also had mobilization of finance to go into how do we actually transition so that there are other opportunities. 35 million people live in the Amazon basin. We think of it as this pristine wilderness. It is an amazing, beautiful forest, but 35 million people live there, many beneath the poverty line. Unless we find livelihoods for them, unless we find a way of developing, we're going to continue to lose the forest. We're going to continue to lose ground. And that's why, again, the community coming together, collective action is the only way we're going to solve this.
But let me put it to you. If I'm, say, someone who's essentially raping the jungle, and doing it in an indiscriminate way and making a lot of money out of it. Why should I be worried by today's agreement?
You should be worried because actually governments are not going to allow you to continue. And I think the other aspect of
this... But governments are often complicit.
Absolutely. But I think now we've got a virtuous circle that has started. There is the pressure that's going to come from the public sector and the private sector, from companies that are actually not going to buy or allow for the trade of commodities that are also creating the deforestation. That is part of this agreement as well. So we're going to start to see new pressure points. And I think that what is clear is we could be cynical and we could say, no, this is not going to actually turn into implementation. Or we could say, today we have changed the tide. We've changed the tide because we have commitments from the biggest countries ever, including Brazil, but including Russia, including China, including the United States. And really, there's not a lot of other good news coming out of this COP. So I think it's really important. Yet, and we are hopeful that
Today's been a remarkable day.
Today
deforestation and methane.
Absolutely. And we need to build on that. But we need to hold these leaders accountable, and we need to hold the private sector and the investors accountable. And I agree with you. What we need to make sure is that the levers are in place to make it tangible and real, so we stop deforestation by 2030.
Justin, you know many of the leading players, though, who are causing this problem and have been. They've got away with it up to now. Again, why should they be shaking and wondering if their business model is now at risk?
I think there's two different things we need to think about. One is the illegality, the criminality that has occurred. It's occurred all around the world over centuries.
But it's embedded in the society,
it's embedded,
isn't it?
But actually the biggest drivers of forest loss are actually for increasing food production. And this is the balance that we've got to get right. And that's also what's different today, is a recognition that this is about the food system, the food we all eat. In the last 2 decades, food production has grown 50%. In the next 10 years, 1.8 billion people are going to enter the middle class, all demanding more food, more calories. How we meet that demand for people to eat and to sustain their lives, together with actually stopping the loss of the forest, is the critical challenge of the decade in this agenda. And we can't get to 1.5 degrees, we can't get to stopping the biodiversity crisis, the loss of nature, unless we turn the tide on deforestation. And that's what's there. Individual countries, I was in the Colombia Pavilion this morning, the president of Colombia made a very impassioned speech.
Yesterday.
Okay. They recognize this is about actually deploying the army for criminality. It's also about engaging with the private sector on supply chains and the food production. It's also about how they can restore some of these landscapes. And it's only if they take, and it's working with the indigenous communities, 57 indigenous communities in Colombia alone. Okay? It's only if they take a whole of government approach are we going to turn the tide. We can't just say, stop the illegality. That's what's different. Countries starting to recognize that. You also heard that from President Biden's comments. The US has never been as engaged. He talked about a whole of government approach. That means, what are they doing to restore lands in the United States? What are they doing to stop the import of illegally deforested product?
Well, let me shift it now and say, look, it's all very well talking about deforestation, cutting down of the trees. What about regeneration? Is there enough in this decision and agreement today to regenerate the forests at the rate that is needed to absorb carbon dioxide?
So thank you for that question, because I actually was the co-chair of the action track on resilience in the UN Food System Summit, where we talked about regeneration being absolutely key.
And the answer is?
And the answer is, in this particular instance, no. We didn't talk about regeneration enough.
Should you have done?
Absolutely. And I think the other point, though, which I would like to make, is we're starting to join the dots, exactly as Justin just said. So the UN Food System Summit talked about regenerative agriculture and the way in which we look at land use, and we stop deforestation for the commodification of food. We're starting to see that the pressure on shifting from industrial agriculture to regenerative agriculture to regenerative land use is huge. We just had today, actually, another announcement called Regen 10, which is bringing together all the smallholders in the food system that would like to shift to regenerative agriculture and regenerative land use. So that's another pressure point. And we're going to see that there will be a call to action of shifting our arable land, 50% of our arable land by 2030 to regenerative agriculture.
So I need to just ask you, Justin, again, regeneration, not just deforestation, stopping it quickly if you can.
Absolutely. Restoration, regeneration is a critical part of the whole journey. It's not just for carbon storage, it is for resilience, as Sandrine said. It is also because that's how we reconnect to nature and to the one home we've got, which is this earth. And it's not just in Brazil and Indonesia. It's right here in the UK, it's in the United States, it's everywhere. We have to restore and allow nature recovery.
Justin Adams from the Tropical Forest Alliance and Sandrine Dixon-de Clef, who is president of the Club of Rome. Thank you both very much indeed. We could keep talking, but alas, our time is up here from the Nature Newsroom for today anyway. I'm back at the same time tomorrow, which is 1600 GMT. So do please join us then for the same kind of inputs and the same kind of variety of views. I wonder what kind of positive news we'll have for you after the deforestation and methane agreements of today. From me, bye-bye. Sorry to bring you to... Sorry.
That's okay.
Aaron Blomgarden. Aaron, welcome to the Nature Newsroom.
Thank you.
You are the founder and the CEO of Emergent.
Yep.
And it's been a pretty good day.
It's been an amazing day so far. Incredible.
You know, could you tell me when you got up in the morning what you were hoping for and then what happened?
Yeah. Look, I knew we were announcing $1 billion for LEAF. I knew we were announcing that there were 7 new companies that are making commitments through LEAF to pay countries to reduce deforestation. I knew we were signing the first set of letters of intent with forest jurisdictions, so 5 forest jurisdictions. So I knew all that. Yeah. What I didn't expect was the impact at the World Leaders Summit and the overall sort of support for both LEAF and then the broader commitment, $12 billion commitment to support forests. In my mind, this has become the Forest COP, and this is the most, I think, meaningful COP since the Paris Agreement, and certainly the most meaningful COP for forests. And really, I think, if we get this right, this is a turning point for the world's forests.
Let's dig a little deeper in a minute about how it actually happened behind the scenes. I think, you know, you'll read about the pledges. I'd love to hear from you a bit the war stories behind the scenes. But before we go there, just for our listeners, why is it so important we protect tropical forests?
Yeah. I think it's known now that we can't achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. There's no path to delivering on a safe climate without reversing and then stopping deforestation. Because deforestation represents 10 to 15% of greenhouse gas emissions. If all the deforestation in the world were a country, it would be the 3rd largest emitter behind China and the US. And so there's really there's no feasible way, even if we decarbonize tomorrow, we can't reach the goals of the Paris Agreement without massively reducing deforestation. And so there's clear benefits from forests to the climate. But then we look at communities that depend. There are billions of people who depend on forests for food and livelihoods and live in the forest. And we talk about biodiversity, plants and animals. We need biodiversity to live. Humanity needs biodiversity to live. And so we're in the process of causing a major extinction event, which is a clear and present danger to humanity. So we've got this sort of triple win: climate, people, and biodiversity.
You know, this really reminds us what we're hearing from science, how critical it is that we, as you said, not just protect the forest for the sake of, you know, keeping CO2, you know, with biomass or absorbing CO2, but it's really just about keeping this planet stable as these massive forests like the Amazon really performing a stabilizing function for the overall planet.
Absolutely. Listen, you know, one of the things that I find that's interesting is we all learn when we're kids that trees suck in CO2 and then they breathe out oxygen, right? And so we all grow up, I think, loving trees, or at least most of us. And intuitively, I think that brings people to, hey, we need to plant trees, right? Which we do. We need to restore forests. But I think the connection that people miss is that forests are also, well, deforestation, through our destruction of forests, they're a huge source of emissions. So I have a mental image of a bunch of coal-fired power plants sitting in the middle of the Amazon spewing out emissions every day. because of the deforestation, because of cutting down forests and converting them to plantation, etc. So we've got to stop that. We've got to immediately stop that, and then we need to restore and replant.
You came up with a mechanism to accelerate that from stopping it from happening.
Yeah.
So I want to hear about that, just in lame terms, what you're doing with the Leaf Coalition. And maybe, Aaron, you just can start from, there's a lot of disappointment with previous pledges, right? We really didn't make progress in stopping deforestation. So explain what you're doing, what's been announced today, and also why it makes you hopeful that this might actually be different.
Yeah, so I think we need to move from pledges to commitment and action. And I think that's what we've designed LEAF to do. So what is LEAF? LEAF stands for the Lowering Emissions from Accelerating Forest Finance. Quite simply, what we're doing is we're mobilizing public and private sector. So it was anchored really by Amazon and then the governments of the UK, US, and Norway. We now have 19 companies that are part of this, and these companies are committing to pay for emission reduction credits that are coming from reducing deforestation at the jurisdictional level, meaning at the national level or a large state level, over the next 5 years. So they're signing up right now to legally binding agreements, right, to say we will pay $10 per ton for jurisdictions that reduce deforestation. Now, those reductions will be verified to a new third-party standard called the Architecture for Right Transactions to make sure that those are real, they've happened, and so we pay after the reductions have happened, and so that way we can be sure that those reductions are real, additional, etc. We have the governments then who are allowing us to leverage that commitment to basically commit more to the forest countries. So the governments are coming in and saying, hey, we will act as a buyer of last resort. So we'll pay a floor price. So if the market doesn't mobilize, and what we're basically doing here is we're really trying to create a new market. It's for really the first time we're bringing the private sector in to support so-called jurisdictional forest protection, meaning when we say jurisdictional, national level programs or large state level programs. And what do those things look like, right? They could be creating new protected areas, it could be enforcing existing protected areas, it could be investing in alternative livelihoods for forest communities that have no other choice but to deforest. There can be a whole host of actions on the ground that this supports.
So it's really like companies say, we're in to stop deforestation, protect what we got, and we're willing to pay for it because it helps us make our contribution in terms of, reducing CO2 emissions. Where does the money go?
Right, so a great question. So the money will go to the communities that are responsible for reversing deforestation. We have to recognize these are payments that happen after the reductions happen, right? So in that sense, it's really a new asset that belongs to the countries or the jurisdictions. But what we're asking them to do is make sure it gets as close to the forest as possible and that it supports additional climate positive action and protecting the forest.
So it's kind of saying, if you deliver, you'll get rewarded.
Exactly. And basically we're trying to change the incentives on the ground that make forests worth more alive than dead. Right now there are very few incentives to keep financial incentives, economic incentives, right, to keep a forest standing. If you're a community that lives around the forest or a government that's doesn't have a lot of other economic opportunities except for converting a forest to agriculture or some other extractive use, you're going to do it, right? There's not another alternative. So what we're trying to do is change the game. Really change economic incentives on the ground to make forests worth more alive than dead.
Because right now, it's more profitable to cut the tree down than let it standing.
Exactly.
You want to change that.
Exactly.
Aaron, we can't afford to be disappointed again. Where would you like to be in a year from now? COP27.
So I think we all need to be focused on single-mindedly on scale and speed. We're out of time. We all know, right? This is the 11th hour. This is COP26. We've been all talking about this for 26 years. There's no more time. We need scale and speed and focus on implementation without sacrificing environmental integrity and quality. And so that's what I'm focused on. We're announcing with LEAF $1 billion this year. Given my druthers, I like to be at 10 billion next year, and then 50 billion. Right? We know we've created something with a partnership with EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, UN Red, and Forest Trends called the Green Gigaton Challenge, and we're basically calling on we need a gigaton of 1 billion tons of emission reduction. So at $10 a ton, that would be $10 billion. Right?
Is that per year?
Yeah. Per year.
So
we need to build. We need to build to that.
We need to build to that. I mean, just for our viewers to understand, I mean, we're emitting about 40 or 50 gigatons a year. So that's one of those.
Exactly. Okay. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Just for a final word, I mean, I promised the audience and the viewers to hear a little bit of the inside story.
Yeah.
It's been very fast, right? I mean, I think it took you about 7 months to get the billion, but what was your big takeaway going now that you'd like to share? Kind of what did it take?
So I think, we recognize that there's not a single company or government or nonprofit that can do this alone. So we need effective platforms for collective action. We need to work together and focus on the same goal. I think that's what we've successfully done with LEAF Coalition. Look, companies are really, at least I would say most large multinational companies now are moving to address climate change. And they want to do something, but they need a safe place to go, right? They need to know that what they're doing is credible. They're doing it with their peers. It's validated by governments. There's NGOs and civil society is aligned with it, and it's the right thing to do. And I think that's what we've tried to do. I can get to technicalities around what's gone wrong with carbon markets over the last 10 years, and we really tried to address those things within the LEAF Coalition. For example, Emergent is a nonprofit. We're the transaction intermediary, but we're a nonprofit, right? We're not working for the companies. We're not working for the governments. We show up. We're working for the environment. That's it. I say that to everyone. We're here as a transaction counterparty, but we're working for the environment, right? That's our goal. So that one thing. Part of that is we've also said, look, any profits on resale of these credits has to go back to the jurisdiction, right? This is not about a trading game. Some investor somewhere can make a lot of money. This is about, I like to call carbon the non-commodity commodity, right? Because a commodity typically is used for production of something else. The value of a carbon credit is the impact on the ground. And so we got to recognize that, right? And so so what we've done is say, okay, any profit that's on trading goes back to the jurisdiction. Third thing I think that was super important, and I think really one of the first time this is done, we put high bar criteria not only on the sellers to make sure that they're really reducing deforestation, but on the buyers. That's critical to demonstrate that the companies are actually on a path to net zero, a credible path to net zero. So we've got 5 criteria for companies to show that they're actually taking action within their own value chains and with their own operations.
So it's not an excuse.
It's not an excuse.
No, you have to do both.
And we've rejected companies, right? We've rejected companies. So we actually think that's an interesting tool to get companies to actually move further, to increase their ambition within their own operations, if we can tie it into this program.
Well, it's been such a pleasure you coming here. I mean, the Nature Newsroom, co-hosted by the Global Commons Alliance, with the mission to empower all actors, companies, investors, cities, to become stewards of our global commons. To have you here and show that's what you're doing on the ground, I mean, I'm very excited about that. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And good luck with COP26.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
Take care.